Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. In the Appalachian Mountains, silence has a way of swallowing screams. Here, in valleys untouched by modern light, families carried not just bloodlines, but curses. It was in one such hollow that whispers spread of a girl, barely a decade old, whose body betrayed her innocence with the swelling of pregnancy. Neighbors would not speak her name aloud, only muttering that she was the product of a family too closely bound, where fathers became uncles and uncles became something far worse. To understand her story is to walk into a chamber that America has sealed shut, for the shame is unbearable. But the truth waits there, and it does not forgive. This girl, 10 years old, was not the first tragedy of her family, nor would she be the last. Her kin had been locked in the mountains for generations, bound by poverty, by isolation, and by choices that would echo through the marrow of their children. They lived in cabins where windows were boarded, where candles burned low to keep the outside world from peering in. Outsiders rarely came near, but when they did, they left with stories they were too frightened to repeat. Stories of twisted faces, wandering eyes, and voices that spoke like broken echoes. The girl's family was one that locals called touched by the devil, but it was not devils that made her. It was men of her own blood. Imagine for a moment the weight of her silence. 10 years old with bones still forming yet carrying life inside her, a child made to bear another child. Her small frame was not ready, but in these forgotten places, readiness was never considered. The line between innocence and corruption blurred generations ago. What should horrify you most is not the act that made her pregnant, but the fact that, in her family, it was not even surprising. To them, it was just another branch on a tree that had long since grown wild and diseased. The mountains shield secrets. They wrap them in fog, bury them under soil, and let time erode memory until only fragments remain. But when fragments are pieced together, they tell of a lineage where love twisted into domination and where children became offerings to keep the bloodline contained. This girl's belly was the cruel proof of a cycle that no one dared to break, and yet, even as her story was whispered, the mountains kept her safe from judgment, allowing the sickness to continue in the shadows. She was not born into a family, she was born into a chain, each link bent and rusted, bound to the one before it. Her grandparents had been first cousins, their parents before them even closer. By the time she came into the world, her very body carried the history of decay written in her DNA. She was frail from the start, with eyes that never seemed to meet in the same direction and limbs that grew uneven. Yet she was treated as ordinary, because in her home everyone bore some mark of the same curse. In the Appalachian hills they called it keeping the blood pure, but what purity could be found in suffering passed down like an heirloom? Her father was not just her father, he was her uncle. To her mother, he was both a brother and a husband. These were bonds twisted by isolation, by a lack of outsiders, by a desperation to cling to what little they had. They justified it as survival, but survival came with a price. When the girl reached her 10th year, the men in her family saw her not as a child, but as another vessel to carry the bloodline forward. It was an inevitability in their eyes, a tradition masked as fate. She did not have a voice in this. No one ever asked her what she wanted. In truth, she did not even know there was a world outside where choices existed. Neighbors would sometimes catch glimpses of her, thin as a shadow, with tangled hair and eyes that looked much older than her age. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried a strange weight, as though she had inherited the sorrow of generations. They noticed when her stomach began to swell. At first, whispers suggested sickness, malnutrition, maybe a tumor, but the truth soon pressed itself into visibility, undeniable in its horror. A child was carrying a child, and the father of that unborn child was her own blood. The line had folded back onto itself, and with it, her future was crushed. Imagine being her, small hands clutching at her belly in confusion, her body aching in ways she could not understand. There were no doctors to guide her, no teachers to protect her, no outsiders willing to step into the holler where her family lived. She bore it in silence just as her mother had, and her grandmother before her. Each generation swallowed its screams so the mountains would not echo with their suffering, and thus the cycle repeated with no one brave enough or perhaps alive enough to break it. As her pregnancy advanced, the cabin around her grew colder, darker, as though the walls themselves knew what they were containing. She would sit on the floorboards, staring at the dirt beneath the cracks, as if trying to escape through the very grain of the wood. Her mother hovered, not as a protector, but as a reflection of what awaited her. Another woman who had been forced into motherhood long before she was ready, who had learned to bury her tears so deep they hardened into silence. For the girl, there was no comfort, only the knowledge that what was happening to her had already happened before. Her body began to break under the strain. She was too small, too fragile, to carry the weight of life inside her. Nights were spent in pain, twisting and crying quietly so the men in the other room wouldn't hear. She knew the rules. Do not complain, do not resist, do not question. Pain was part of her inheritance. The holler had no doctors, no nurses, no clinics. Only the hands of family, hands that had caused her suffering in the first place, would be there to deliver her child. And so she waited, trapped inside a body that was betraying her, carrying a future she never asked for. Whispers spread beyond the hollow, down into the town. People spoke of the family in hushed tones, saying the girl had been cursed, saying God had turned his face away from that bloodline. But though they whispered, no one intervened. It was easier to let the mountains keep their secrets than to confront them, easier to treat her suffering as an inevitable part of some hidden Appalachian darkness, rather than face the reality that people, flesh and blood, fathers and brothers, had chosen to do this to her. When the time came, the birth was not a joyous moment. It was an ordeal. Her screams, muffled by the wooden walls, were swallowed by the trees outside. The child she delivered was not just a bar, but it was a mirror of the sickness running through her family's veins. Born fragile, with features already hinting at the deformities that come from blood that has turned back on itself too many times. To the family, it was only natural. To outsiders, had they seen, it would have been a horror beyond comprehension. For this girl, barely 10 years old, motherhood was not a gift, it was a sentence. Her childhood ended the moment her belly began to swell, and with the child's first breath, she was bound to a cycle she could never escape. The years that followed blurred together, as though time itself wanted to forget her. She raised the child as best as she could, though in truth she was still a child herself. Her arms were thin, her face still soft with youth, yet she carried the weight of motherhood on her shoulders. The baby cried often, sickly from the start, its tiny body a frail reminder of the bloodline that refused to heal. Each cough, each wheeze, was a reminder that what had been done to her was not only destroying her own life, but condemning the next generation as well. Her family did not see tragedy in it, they saw continuation. To them, the child was proof that their ways endured, that the line would not be broken. They cloaked their shame in silence, convincing themselves that outsiders would never understand, that this was simply the way of their people. But the girl knew, in her eyes, even at that young age, there lived an understanding too deep for words. She had become another ghost of the Appalachians, alive but trapped in a life that felt more like a coffin. The mountains around her, once indifferent, began to feel like prison walls. Every ridge, every tree, every trail she walked seemed to whisper the same truth. There was no escape. Outsiders rarely came near, and when they did, they looked the other way. Poverty excused sins, isolation excused crimes, and so her suffering continued, unseen by the world beyond the holler. What haunts most about her story is not just what was done to her, but the silence that followed. No authorities came, no neighbors intervened. Her pain was absorbed into the earth, as though the soil itself had grown accustomed to drinking the blood and tears of children. In a way, that silence was more damning than the act itself. For silence is what allows cycles like hers to endure, generation after generation. Her child, fragile and sickly, grew under the same roof, surrounded by the same twisted family that had broken her, and as the years passed, the girl became a woman, though she never truly had the chance to be one. She lived in two bodies at once, the child she still was, and the mother she was forced to become. It was this fracture, this tearing of innocence, that carved her into a figure of quiet horror, one of many forgotten children of Appalachia, buried alive in history's blind spot. As the girl grew older, the child she had given birth to began to resemble not just a son or daughter, but a sibling, almost a twin pulled from her own reflection. The lines of family blurred until even she could not untangle them. Was she a mother, or was she a sister? Was the man who fathered the child her parent or her uncle, or something darker still? This confusion was not only hers, it ran through the entire family like poisoned water. No one spoke of it aloud, but every face in that cabin knew. They had built their lives upon secrets, but their children's bodies carried the truth where no silence could erase it. The sickness of the bloodline revealed itself more each year. The child, though alive, was plagued by strange ailments, eyes unfocused, speech slow, bones bent in ways that no doctor would ever treat because no doctor would ever see them. The girl, now barely into her teens, looked upon her child with a hollow tenderness. She loved it, for it was part of her, but she also feared it, because she knew deep down that she was raising the very proof of her family's curse. Each cry in the night reminded her of the generations before her, of her mother's pain, of her grandmother's silence. She began to understand that she was not the end of the story. She was only another chapter. By the time outsiders finally heard of her condition, the tale had already warped into legend. Some claimed she had been possessed, others said her family had struck some unholy bargain to survive the mountains. These stories, half rumor, half truth, spread in whispers through the towns at the edge of Appalachia, but no one ventured into the hollow to confirm them. Fear kept them away, but so did convenience. To look directly at her suffering would mean admitting that this was not just some myth of the hills, but a reality born of neglect, poverty, and human cruelty. And so she remained hidden, raising her child in the same darkness that had consumed her youth. Her face grew sharper, her eyes older, her silence heavier. By the time she reached her teenage years, she seemed far older than her age. Aged not by time, but by experience that no human being, let alone a child, should ever endure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent, as her neighbors did, or would you have tried to break the chain? By the time she reached 16, she was no longer just a victim of the past. She was already the architect of the next generation's tragedy. The child she bore at 10 was growing, yet still sickly, its body carrying the same markers of decay that had haunted her. And the men in her family, the very ones who had stolen her childhood, began to set their eyes on her again. For them, the cycle was never meant to break. Each girl was only a vessel, and each vessel would be used until it collapsed. To them, this was not horror, it was order. Her body had endured one pregnancy, and it would endure more. In the eyes of her family, that was her purpose. But the girl had begun to see the truth more clearly now. She had seen what the sickness did to her child. She had seen what silence did to her mother. And though she carried no weapons, no allies, she carried knowledge, and sometimes knowledge can be its own rebellion. She began to ask herself questions her family had never dared to voice. Why did no one leave the hollow? Why was love twisted into violence? Why had no one, not once, chosen to end the cycle? But answers never came. The mountains kept them locked away, just as surely as they kept her locked in her cabin. Each day she walked the same worn paths, past the same trees, listening to the same silence. The outside world might as well have been a dream. She could sense it, just beyond the ridges, but she could not touch it. And the longer she stayed, the more she feared she would never escape at all. For the child she bore, escape was already impossible. It was too weak, too tethered to the family's curse to survive beyond the hollow. Some say the child did not live long. Others claim it lingered, growing only half-formed, Another broken link in a chain that stretched back further than anyone could remember. No record exists, only rumors, and the haunted memory of a girl who was forced to be a mother before she even knew what it meant to live. And this is what makes her story so unbearable. She was not alone. Her case was not unique. Across the Appalachian Mountains, in hidden hollers and cabins where the light rarely reached, others lived and suffered the same way. Some died young, some bore children of their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, and all of them vanished into history's silence, unnamed, uncounted, as though their existence itself was too shameful for America to acknowledge. Her story does not end with her name because her name was never written. No birth certificate, no school records, no gravestone that bears her memory. She lived and died as though the mountains swallowed her whole. What remains are fragments, rumors passed through families, whispers in town squares, and the unshakable truth etched into the faces of her descendants. They live on, some still hidden deep in Appalachia, carrying features that betray the history no one will speak aloud. This is how America buries its sins, not with justice, not with healing, but with silence. Silence that lets generations suffer in the dark. The girl who became a mother at 10 was not a legend, not a ghost story told to frighten children. She was real, her suffering was real, and the child she bore, whether it lived or not, was proof that the past was still alive, festering inside the bones of the living. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with beauty, but within their shadows lies a truth most will never see. A truth about isolation, about bloodlines turned inward, about children robbed of their futures before they even understood the meaning of life. This girl, faceless in history but unforgettable in horror, represents the secret America cannot look at directly. Because to look at her is to admit that such things were not just accidents of geography, but choices made by men, repeated over and over, until innocence itself became extinct. And so her story lingers in the air like a ghost, not a haunting of the supernatural but of reality, a reminder that children can be swallowed whole by their own families, and that entire lineages can become prisons where love is twisted into cruelty. Her suffering may be forgotten by history books, but not by the soil where she walked, not by the walls that heard her cries, and not by the whispers that carried her memory forward. In the end, what remains is a question. How many more were there? How many other nameless girls bore the weight of sins not their own? And how many still suffer in silence in the hidden corners of a country that prefers its history buried beneath the dirt? Some truths are too dark to erase, no matter how much silence is poured over them. This was hers, and now it is ours to remember. Would you like me to also craft a haunting YouTube description for this video, matching the same tone and optimized for search?